Hi, welcome to this session. My name is Dani Gill. I'm the Artistic Director of Ennis Book Club Festival, and I'm joined by writer Donna Freitas. This event is for Clare Library Service, and as part of Teen Week, Donna was meant to be in Ireland last week for the Teen Week celebration, and unfortunately, due to COVID, did not make it physically to Ireland. So we are now doing this event online. Donna, you're very welcome. I'm glad you're feeling a bit better.
Oh, it's so nice to talk to you. And I'm still sad we didn't get to talk in person. So, but it's good to at least feel healthier.
Yeah, well, I'm delighted that we get to do this anyway. And I know it's slightly different, but I'm going to speak to Donna today about what was mentioned in the brochure for Teen Week, the idea of social media and the digital age and the repercussions and consequences and outcomes of that, I guess. And then also a bit about Donna's creative process and her journey as a writer, because I'm sure new audiences will want to know about that. So Donna, how about starting there? You were meant to come to the festival to talk about your adult debut, but you've also written 10 different novels for young people. So maybe you could start by telling people maybe how you came to be a writer.
My path to writing is not the same as most of my writer colleagues, I think. Often when I'm on a panel of writers and the question comes up about, when did you know you were going to be a writer? When did you start writing? Everyone around me will say something like, oh, I started when I was 6 or 8 or 10, or like I knew always that this is what I wanted to do. And I've always been a reader. My mom, like one of my favorite memories as a kid was my mom used to take me to the library every week, and she would let me pick out all the books I wanted, no matter how many books, as many as they allowed me to take out. And so this was a big part of my childhood, was just reading. And so I loved books, but I never thought about writing them. And it wasn't until I was actually in graduate school that I wrote my first book. But I still never thought I would write novels. And then one day I started writing a novel just kind of on a lark, like just for fun. And I never really thought it would see the light of day. But I think I was 30 or 31 when my first book came out. And, it felt like this very surreal thing happened to me. I suddenly got to start writing books. And then once I did, though, I really loved it and I kept doing it.
I guess you've mentioned there the role of the library and reading, and obviously this event is sponsored by Clare Library Service as part of Teen Week. And I do feel myself like the library in my hometown was hugely instrumental in me not just becoming a writer, but just being a lover of books from a very young age. And I love that image of you piled up with books going home. I'm curious to know, because I know that you teach and this is a huge part of your life. And I just had a conversation with someone today in their 20s about reading. And she had said, I was a huge reader when I was younger. And then I stopped reading and I'm not sure why. But she said, I do actually feel like a big reason might be my phone, because when I became a teenager and I got a phone, she said, like I would be on my phone for hours after school, having no comprehension of why that might be bad, for me. And I suppose maybe this is sort of a natural segue into this conversation around kind of how you spend your time. Do you think in terms of reading and the habit of reading that it is really about taking time out and giving it the space? Like, how have you maintained your own relationship with books over time?
Well, I mean, I think books are, they're one of my favorite objects, I guess. Like I have a gazillion books. I have too many books. I love getting new books. It's very exciting. I think, I don't know, reading was such a huge part of my life, like always. It was also a huge part of my mother's life. And so it was something that we really shared together. But she was a teacher also. And she instilled this love of reading in me. And, you know, we would make a big deal about like going to get books to sit and read on the beach in the summer. Like it wasn't regarded as like work when I was growing up. It was regarded as fun. Like, what are we going to read this summer? Like what, you know, like it was like an exciting thing for both her and for me. Or if we're going to go on vacation, like what books are we going to pick out for, you know, for our vacation? And so I think it was, I think sometimes we raise, like we force books on kids, or like you know, reading is a chore, like that for a lot of people. And I think it was never a chore in my life. It was always a pleasure. And I think that helps. It really changed my relationship with books, or that's what established my relationship with books, I guess. Like it wasn't something that you did in school. It was something you did in general, like, cause it was fun.
Yeah. And do you think, you know, I guess in terms of social media, this is something that's come up in your work, and I know it's a topic you're quite interested in your opinion, have we become very immersed in a digital world, in a world that is, how do you think it compares to what we might call the real world, even though I'm less and less sure of the distinction between those?
You know, I've wondered for a long time, when are we going to get control of our use of our devices? Like, when are we going to figure this out? And I've almost started to lose faith that we're even going to try. Like, I sort of feel like we've just given ourselves over to a kind of helplessness in relation to our devices. Because I don't really see anybody working to change it. I see a lot of worry about our usage, how much usage we have, and how addicted we all are. But I don't really see us trying to change it. Yeah. And I think, you know, one of the things that whenever I'm teaching college students, I often talk to them about this issue, about their devices. And it always comes up if I'm actually like in a physical classroom. So like before the pandemic started and I was a professor standing up in front of a classroom, you know, my students would have their phones and we would talk about them. And I'll never forget a conversation that I had with my students. I was teaching a literature class, and my students were reading this one particular novel I had assigned, and they had an incredible strong reaction to it. Like some of them loved it and some of them hated it, but it was actually I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith.
Oh yeah, okay.
And which is like an old favorite of mine. And they were obsessed with it. But one of the things that came up in the conversation that was so interesting to me was I kept trying to dig for what was it that was making them so obsessed with this book. And finally, one of my students said, she was like, I love it so much. It's just that, you know, it's like I have this spot in my house where I like sit and I read it and I get myself a cup of tea and then I'll read for like an hour and I won't even look at my phone. So she said that, and I was like, oh, and I was like, say, what do you mean? And she was like, oh, well, you know, like I don't even touch my phone. I'm just so absorbed by it. And then my class got into a discussion about how they read. And they told me, they were like, well, you know, it's kind of hard to read more than one line in a book without grabbing for my phone.
Yeah.
And so I thought, what? Like, you mean, you know, I'm just trying to imagine myself. I was like, what if after every sentence or two, I was grabbing my phone and looking at it? Like,
yeah,
how in the world do you function like that? You know, and no wonder why we're all so stressed out. And my students especially are overwhelmed with work, because how can you read it? Like, I was thinking about all the reading that gets assigned to our students. Yeah. And then trying to imagine, how do you plow through that if every second you're grabbing for a phone? And one of the things that made me think so much about is just, you know, concentration and the pleasures of being absorbed, like being absorbed in anything, you know, like not being able to turn away, like being absorbed in a book or a conversation, like that is a kind of pleasure that we experience. And if our phones are like, they're getting in the way of that simple pleasure, like I find that really worrisome. I just think of how stressed out that must make people if they literally can't, like if my students literally can't read more than a sentence without turning away from a book. So that really worries me.
Yeah, and I guess what you're talking about there in terms of like attention span and how we spend time, I guess this is a really critical thing, because I find in my life, obviously I'm a big reader and I'm also a writer, but I notice that when I put my phone away, which I can't actually do often, usually because of work commitments, not anything else, but I have found, particularly if I go on a writing retreat or I'm having writing days and I put my phone away for like the day or even 5 or 6 hours, I really find that my mind and my disposition change. And one of the things that I've always noticed, which at first I kind of thought had to do with, being away in different environments, is when I go to do a residency in a place that is not my home, that is not familiar to me, and I put my phone away, and in these residency places in Ireland, there's no Wi-Fi, and often even your phone signal might be intermittent, and there's no television. So you're usually in a residence, usually somewhere beautiful, like physically, geographically kind of stunning. And I've always found when I'm in those spaces, not only am I writing and probably a bit more generally well because I'm maybe out walking or, going for swims, but I've noticed that my sleep is better, that I get tired earlier in the evening. And I think it's because I'm reading more and less digital engagement. And I find it has a massive effect on my body. And I guess, with our digital lives, we're kind of out of our bodies, aren't we? Like what you're describing there, I love that idea of, I sit in this seat and I have my cup of tea, and, because that is environmental. It's kind of like you're creating an inner climate to mirror your external climate of holding this book. And that's kind of, maybe, do you think it's a mindfulness activity almost?
I definitely think what we need to do in relation to our devices is learn to make decisions about them, whether it's we put ourselves in a space where we literally can't touch them, like we don't have access to them, they're not within reach, like when we read, I don't know, put them in a lockbox even, or give them to someone else, which I've heard my students talking about how, like, when they need to get something done, they like give their phone to their roommate and then they're like, don't give this back to me until I finish my paper. Or and I think sometimes when we make decisions like that, we feel like failures, like, oh, I have a lack of willpower, I have to give my phone away to my roommate in order to get something done. And I actually think it's the opposite. I think what we're doing is we're recognizing that, this is a device that calls to me, I can't not touch it. And so I need to take measures. Like, that is a show of willpower. It's a show, It's a decision that you're making around it. And I think that's, I tell my students a lot, like, part of what we need to do is become critical thinkers about our devices. And we need to realize that we can make decisions around them. We have to realize too, they're designed to addict us. Like the theory behind the apps and the devices themselves is from, they're using, gambling like theory. So like the same theory that goes into creating like a slot machine.
Yeah.
It's designed to like keep you pulling, that's what's going into making our devices. And I think once we realize that, like, okay, these are designed to addict us, then that's, in some ways, that's power, it's knowledge. And then we have to really begin to make decisions around them, but I think part of the issue is many of us are not making those decisions. Like we're just sort of like capitulating and saying, I am helpless in the face of this. And that doesn't make us feel good either. Like it deprives us of all those things, we've been talking about, and even just the simple pleasure of a conversation. So I think we just need to learn to become decision makers about these things. And I mean, I struggle with this too. I don't even have a smartphone. Like I struggle with it on my laptop, and like I have apps installed on my laptop to shut down the internet so I can't use it when I'm writing. And because I feel all the same addictions, And I also feel all the same displeasure about like feeling like I'm hijacked by the pull of the internet or like the pull of checking things.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think you're so right. It's an interesting way to put it, that it is this choice. It is an act of willpower to actually disengage with the device. And if it requires handing it over, or like say maybe putting it in a lockbox or something, at least you're making that decision. I know you've just mentioned that you don't actually have a smartphone, and I'm thinking, you know, in terms of marketing, I guess when you think about it, you can get what they call dumb phones, like a burner type phone. But I guess without us almost realizing at first, we just became immersed in a phone market that was heavily dominated and is completely dominated by smartphones. And in ways, they were put in front of us in a kind of a, I'm not going to say overnight way, but, you know, I remember my first mobile phones, and they literally could call and text, and, you know, there were no apps or anything. And there was a big difference between that and say the smartphone as it emerged, because with those older phones, it was a means of communication and contact, but it still required you to either use your voice or type words. And we didn't have apps and all of that. And now when you go into any phone shop, like whether we like it or not, people in many ways have been completely coerced into purchasing smartphones because they've become the norm. And I'm wondering, I guess, for young people who might be watching this and won't have known an era before Wi-Fi, before Wi-Fi, dial-up internet, before smartphones, have you noticed in life, in terms of behavior, I guess, do you think that social media and our apps and our engagement with our digital devices have been changing us as human beings? Like, do you notice or feel that our communication is different because of our digital lives?
Oh, I mean, of course it is. I mean, how can it not be? I mean, even just the experience of walking down the street is different now for everybody, right? Because we're often, you know, looking down. And I mean, just even just our regular engagement with the world. Like I mentor young writers, and this particular writer that I was mentoring, she and I, like, you know, our mentorship relationship happened to coincide with the beginning of COVID or during COVID. And so one of the things we would do is we would just meet for walks, because we couldn't, you know, like there wasn't anywhere to go. And so we were meeting for walks. And so we got in the habit of doing that. And then things started to open up again. And one day we met for a walk, and I had to return something at a store. And I just asked her, I was like, oh, do you mind if I do this? And so she came with me to the store, and there was a big long line for the return. And so she was standing there with me, and then she was like, do you mind if I go look? It was like a clothing store. And I said, no. And so I was like standing there in the line, and, you know, for like, I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes. And then she came back and she was like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry I left you. I forgot you don't have a phone. And I was like, oh, it's no big deal. And every single person in the line with me was like this. I was literally the only person who was just looking around.
Yeah.
And then we got in a conversation, and she was like, well, what do you do when you're in a line? Like, because you don't have a phone. So she just asked me this. And I was like, I just look at people. I just like look around. And my students have actually asked me that in the past, like, because they know I don't have a phone. Or I have a dumb phone. I have a burner phone, what you said. Like, I just have like a phone that calls and texts, and that's it. And and my students know this, and they've asked me before, they're like, Professor Freitas, what do you do when you're in line? And I'm like, I just look around. And then they've informed me, you know, that's kind of creepy. And I'm like, but, you know, this is what everybody used to do. We just used to look at the world. And but I was thinking about how even just the etiquette of, I guess now you're not supposed to look around you. You're supposed to look at your phone. Maybe it's impolite to not look at your phone because people find this intrusive. But so I just think that that's so interesting. The idea that this one young woman was worried about me being in line without a phone. And, thought like, what, oh my gosh, I've just abandoned this person to her thoughts, or I don't know, or just to her gaze and nothing else. So of course, I mean, our whole relationship to people and to the world has changed because of these devices that fit in our hands.
I've performed a kind of an exercise with myself around kind of what you're describing there with waiting and your phone. And for a while, a few months in my life, I noticed that I was taking my phone out like that if I was waiting for someone at a cafe. And I thought, this isn't good. Why am I taking it out? There's no real reason for me to take it out. I haven't like missed anything. There's no point in like scrolling through, Instagram or whatever. So for a couple of months, when I was waiting on someone or waiting for something, I didn't look at my phone and instead started to look around. And I think the exercise of observation is so valuable. I mean, it's really valuable to writers and like creatives, because getting to witness human behavior and your surroundings is obviously really, really valuable in terms of being able to come up with, story and kind of a perspective. But also it's a human trait that I wonder if it's affecting how we perceive each other as people. Because when you think about, body language and people talking what they talk versus what they do and what they're showing, I wonder if it's doing anything to us on that level of maybe not being as adept at picking up those kind of cues. Because I read a study during COVID about empathy and face masks and how, that we were less empathetic because we couldn't see facial expressions. So it was easier for people to be rude in the supermarket or wherever you were because you couldn't see the expression on someone's face. And I thought that was so interesting. And I thought, wow, in the space of whatever, 9 months, 10 months, we are feeling empowered, almost like that idea of wearing a mask in the same way that you might wear a Halloween mask, that in some way was kind of dehumanizing us. And I wonder with the device thing, like you're describing there, this automatic assumption that in our moments between events and things that we need to be occupied, and this is how we're occupying ourselves. I guess, is it symptomatic of a much larger problem we are having as people, where we're generally maybe too busy minded and we're keeping it going, we're keeping that loop going, that we all know that we're living in a mental health crisis like globally, and people are struggling a lot more. I'm not going to say a lot more than they used to, because I do believe that depression and anxiety and a lot of conditions were always there, but I guess we have more language now for diagnoses and things like that. But I do wonder, is it symptomatic of a much larger issue we're having around being in ourselves, around being comfortable in life, around rest versus being switched on? Do you think it is related to a wider kind of humanitarian issue?
I mean, there's no doubt that our devices keep us going in this way that's really unforgiving, when you think about it, or just our ability to pile up our to-do list now, or just email itself, or just all the texting, or it's like a giant constant to-do list where you feel like you have to be immediately available and constantly on. And I think that there's something really inhumane about that. And I even just feel everyone in my life knows that I don't have a smartphone, but I think people think of that as like one of my quirks, or but I receive so much pressure to get one anyway.
Interesting.
And just like disbelief of, well, what do you do when you go out? Like, how do you get in touch with people? Or like, what, how I don't know, like how do I live this way? And there's so much resistance, I would say, that I encounter to the fact that I don't have one. And the reality is that I don't want one, because I know myself. And when I'm out in the world, I don't want to be checking a phone. Like the only time I have my dumb phone, but it only works like if someone calls me, and like everyone knows not to text me because I still have like, I have to type it like a letter, you know, like it only has a number pad. I don't even have a keyboard. It's like, so in order for me to like create a D, I have to like type, you know, a couple keys, you know, to make that happen. So texting is not like part of my life. Like, unless I'm, you know, going to be late for somebody, like I never text. And, but part of, I'm trying to make this choice of when I leave my house, I am off. Like, I'm done with work. Like, you can't get in touch with me. Like, I'm just out in the world, and that's what I want for myself. And I've just been really surprised how harder that's getting to maintain, or just how much people want to take that away, or they feel uncomfortable with it. And, you know, to go back to the topic of reading, you know, one of my favorite things to do is to like take a book or a magazine, or like an actual physical book or a magazine, and you know, go and sit at a bar, and, you know, in a restaurant, in a nice restaurant. And like, if I'm going to meet a friend there or something, I'll often go a half hour early, and I'll take my book, and I'll order a glass of wine, and I'll sit at the bar and I'll read. And it used to be that I was surrounded by people doing very similar things. You know, they'd have their New Yorker, or, you know, some sort of novel. And if you were sitting alone, it was normal to have a reading material, like old fashioned, you know, physical reading material. And now, like, I almost never see that. I almost never, ever see anybody with, you know, with an actual book, like sitting somewhere. And usually they're just like, if someone is alone in a restaurant, you know, or sitting at a bar, they have their phone out and they're scrolling. Yeah. And, you know, even just thinking about that sort of shift in our behavior, we no longer, because, you know, for me, going to sit and with a book somewhere, like, you know, order a cup of coffee and sit with a book, like, that's pleasure time for me. That's what, you know, it's fun time. It's a fun thing to do. And, you know, I think we've replaced that sort of pleasure with just like, you know, doing the eternal scroll. And so I think that changes our relationship to the world, but also our relationship to reading and to books and to like physical material that we, you know, look at.
I am very nosy when I see someone reading in public. I'm always like trying to see the title or the spine, or, you know, and then I start to become conscious of what I'm doing. And I think, oh, I look like a weirdo, because they're probably like, what is wrong with that woman? But it's just that I'm always curious to see what people are reading. And I've noticed, actually, like you're saying, it is quite unusual now to see people read in public. Like, there are certain cafes in the city where I live, in Galway, where they're quiet enough and they're kind of late in the evening places where you could go get a cup of tea and comfortably read a book. I often find that a lot of bars or restaurants are playing such loud music and stuff, you know, that it can be really difficult to try and focus in on like a text. But there are a couple of cafes in the city where I've noticed other people, you know, with books reading. And when I've been away, I've noticed people on trains, like physically reading books, or public transport. And I'm always kind of curious to know what they're reading. I suppose, in terms of, you know, what you said earlier about you don't know where it's going in terms of our relationship with digital devices and with social media. And I've wondered this too. And I've kind of been saying in the last few years, it'll be really interesting in 5 years' time or 10 years' time to see where we are at with this, because I totally agree with you. I think that we saw the addition of, you know, broadband, Wi-Fi, apps for everything as progression, and we've bought in really big to that idea. And now everybody in some ways is a slave to their device. And there's something quite weird going on, in the sense that I know that the people who were meant to come to this event in a live space were very interested in this topic, and they're a younger age group, you know, teenagers. And I suppose I feel like there's definitely something funny happening where people understand and know that they're a little bit enslaved to their device or to these processes, but then also not really fully knowing how to get out of that, you know. And you're right, I don't think there are many avenues at the moment or provisions that consider this. I mean, from a wellness point of view, I like to think that someone in Silicon Valley or wherever they are coming up with, you know, some sort of maybe next stage of what we now know, you know, as the app, social media, digital era. But then part of me, the cynic part, is also thinking, but is that a very naive thought? Because like you say, marketing, gambling, psychology, like we're actively being manipulated by the internet, and everyone knows and everyone accepts it. Like we don't actually say, oh, you know, when Facebook changed the blue notification light to red, it was because red is emergency, danger, something is, you know, pay attention. And we can talk about these things, but people aren't necessarily disturbed, you know, on a kind of a level to warrant investigation into this. I'm sure there's probably people out there maybe doing PhDs and research on this, and possibly across different kind of areas, you know, psychologists, educators, writers, artists, you know, maybe looking at this. But I guess, if we could see like 5 years time, 10 years time from where we are now, do you have any feelings on what you would love for that to look like? You know, what would the kind of scenario maybe be? Because I'm mindful that I guess I came to your work through the Unplugged series, which is a futuristic kind of a place. And in that particular future, people have literally given up their bodies to be part of an app world where they can do anything. It's still based to some degree on memes, but they can literally, you know, fly, become different versions of themselves. And so you painted a really interesting scenario of a futuristic landscape where something like this is happening. But here in life as we know it, what would you like to see in the future were we to remedy or try to remedy these issues? What might that look like?
Well, I don't think we can wait for Silicon Valley to do this. I don't think they're going to. You know, I think that they clearly this is about, like, they want our eyeballs, you know. And one of the things I tell my students is, you know, that they like Netflix, for example, sees its number one competitor as sleep, as like our sleep. They literally think that, like, they're trying to stop us from sleeping, because when we sleep, we tune out and they can't get our attention. And my students were like shocked when I told them that. And I'm like, oh no, this is it. Like, you're like, they're like, smartphones are designed to stop you from sleeping, stopping you from like looking away. And when you think about that, that's so sinister. And because it's so, talk about wellness, it's like it's the opposite of wellness. And so, you know, I don't think we can rely on Silicon Valley, but I do think if anything is going to change, it has to be grassroots.
Yeah.
You know, it has to be in the way that we parent our kids, and it has to be in the ways that we educate them, like from very, very early. Like we need to think of ourselves as interrupters. Like we need to actively interrupt, you know, people's relationship with social media. We have to keep asking this question, like, what does it mean to have a healthy relationship with my devices? Like we have to ask it and ask it again, and we have to try to answer that question. We have to try to figure out, what does it look like to have a healthy relationship? Is it different for everybody? But we have to become critical thinkers about our devices, like just like we become critical thinkers about history and literature. Like we have to see social media and our devices as as these like sources of information, or these objects we have to do critical thinking about. And so we have to be taught to do it. And, you know, I think one of the problems is that, you know, all of our educational institutions have just jumped on the bandwagon, right? Like we've gone digital, like in every aspect of our lives. And, you know, sometimes we have to, like, here we are, and you and I are interacting over Zoom, and that's really wonderful in so many ways. But at the same time, like, are we going to give up other modes of interaction because we can do this? So like, I think, you know, we love to talk about the pros and the ease of, you know, like of social media and, you know, our smartphones and what they do for us, but we really, really have to reckon with the cons, and we're not doing it. So I think like this has to be we have to like make a like a decision as a culture, like in a widespread way, to interrupt this, because Silicon Valley's not going to do it for us.
Yeah.
So, but I don't see us doing it. Like I see us just kind of moaning and groaning about it and being like, oh yeah, this is terrible. You know, it's just awful. Like we don't know what to do about it, but actually not doing not doing anything about it.
Do you think, because it's interesting, you've mentioned, even educational facilities and them jumping on board with this, and that's interesting, because what you're saying is totally true. We have brought the digital culture to everything. So literally everything that we do now, you go to a restaurant, they have 3 social media accounts. You go down to, your local, what even used to be experiences like the cinema or the theater, they all have websites, they all have social media channels. A lot of people in different areas have felt a kind of a pressure to have a social media presence, and unless you have a particular level of social media engagement, there's a perception that you're not going to compete, or you're not going to be visible, or you're not going to be seen. I know you're saying I don't think they'll do it, and I agree. I feel like a lot of people won't do it because they would see it as a negative, or they'd see it as shooting themselves in the foot. But let's just talk for a minute particularly about educational institutes, because they are the leaders in terms of teaching, in terms of bringing us through education, whatever your field is, and equipping us with the skills to do whatever it is we want to do in life. And you've mentioned critical thinking, and this is a skill that many people pick up in education, 2nd and 3rd level education. Do you think that educational institutes should or could, to some degree, I don't know if boycott is the right kind of word, but could they do that with their digital presence? And how do you think that might affect things? I know this is very hypothetical, and I'm aware that you are also, you're a teacher, you're a professor in an institute, so maybe it's a tricky question, but let's just remember we're talking about a hypothetical. What would that do? In your opinion, do you think that ethically or morally there are certain parts of our society who may have more of a choice around their engagement? Do you think in a utopian environment they would do that? They would not engage?
I mean, I have been waiting. So a lot of universities, because I've done all this research also on social media, at least before the pandemic, they would have me to campus, and, like at universities here, in the United States, people are talking about the problem of, this problem, but there's sort of almost like a helplessness of what do we do? And one of the things I've said is, like, one of the things I'm really interested in is the idea of, like, what if we thought about our spaces, or like our campuses, like our buildings, and like, an actual university campus with its greens, and as, what if we think in terms of like digital architecture, and we start deciding, okay, this building is going to be Wi-Fi free, and we're going to put classrooms there, and it's going to be like an old, like, because we can do that because we own this campus. Like, this is ours. Like sometimes I feel like people forget, like, they are in control of their spaces. Like, they could decide to unplug the internet or like to not have Wi-Fi in a certain space, or they could decide to, have, digital free lounges like here and there, or like a cafeteria where, you're not allowed to bring your smartphone, like when you show up to eat, because this is our social cafeteria and we don't have our phones here. Like, there's no reason why we can't make these decisions. We're just not doing it.
Yeah.
And sometimes when I make these suggestions, people sound shocked. They're like, like, as though like it hasn't even occurred to them that they are in control of their own spaces, that they could make decisions like this and actually just do it. And then see what happens, like, see how it works out. And like, do people use these spaces? Like, do they really need them? Like, how could we experiment with the library? Like, do we want to put in lock boxes, like, for phones? And like, or, you know, even for studying, you know, in like little rooms, like, do we want to literally hand in our phone when we walk into the library? Like, there's no reason why we can't. Like, we're just not making these decisions. And so I keep waiting for people to do something like this, for a university, for example, or some sort of educational institution, to make their mark and distinguish themselves by deciding, we're going to do things differently. We're going to make decisions around this. We're not helpless. Like, as institutions, we're not helpless in the face of this. But I'm surprised and sort of dismayed that I haven't really seen this kind of creative decision making around social media, because we don't have to just live, you know, without any boundaries around it, but we're just not making those choices. And so I'm waiting for those institutions, and I do feel like it has to happen on the level of education, because we're the people, like, you know, we're the places that are really doing critical thinking about this stuff. Like, that's where this happens. And, you know, we're not there in theory to make money, right? Like, Silicon Valley's there to make money, but educational institutions are there to, in theory, to educate. Like, you know, let's be idealistic about it. I know that that's not always true too, but, you know, I feel like if it's going to happen, that's where it's going to happen. Like, librarians are going to be like, okay, let's like get some funding. Can I have 200 euros? And I'm going to, I don't know, buy a bunch of lock boxes, and I'm going to stick them at the front desk. And I'm just going to put up a sign and say, like, want to give up your smartphone? You know, like, you know, come hand it in here, and like, you'll, you know, turn it in and I'll put it in here. And then you get a key and you go off. And then when you come back, you can get it back. Yeah. Like a locker. I don't know. Like, it's not that hard. Like, we can do these things.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I love that idea. I think it would be amazing. I'm also kind of thinking, when you're saying about library spaces, though, definitely, yes, it could be a thing in library spaces. But I also wonder if, I could be wrong, but are the types of people who are frequenting the library at the moment also the types of people that may want to be away from their phones? And I've noticed, again, not many, but a couple of places. There's one place here in the city where they don't have Wi-Fi, and they have it written on a blackboard: we do not have Wi-Fi, talk to each other, you know? That's awesome. And I love to see that, because I think it's a reminder. It's a reminder that we are social creatures and we can engage with each other, and we don't have to be engaging with a piece of equipment over having a conversation. And it would be really interesting to see what you're talking about applied even in certain bar spaces or restaurants. Because, you know, like, one of the things that I think is really sad, when you go for brunch or dinner somewhere and you see people eating and they're both looking at their phones and they're not talking. Like, I've always noticed that, and I've always thought, wow, like, there's something sad about it, not just socially for who they might be as people, but even to think that they're eating a meal and may not be very conscious of what they're even eating because they're looking at their phone, you know. And any of the kind of practices of mindfulness around eating, you know, kind of encourage us to, like, eat slowly, don't have, you know, devices around you, consider kind of your digestive system and all of that kind of thing. I would love to see what you're talking about applied in certain situations like that, because I wonder if, as a social experiment, it would create something. Like, I think there'd be a huge knock-on effect. Like, I'm quite friendly. I would talk to strangers easily, and I don't find it intimidating. But I feel like a lot of people don't necessarily have whatever it might be. I don't even know if it's confidence, but, you know, initiative, you know, incentive to speak to others. And to some degree, if you were going into, like, imagine going into a bar and putting your phone in a lockbox and knowing that everybody else there has done the same thing, then it's kind of like we're creating a common denominator then of no one having their phone. So you can comfortably then sit in that space and have a drink and know that the person next to you is also there without their phone. And I wonder if we need something like that, that gives us permission to disengage, because I think, like you've mentioned in a few different ways, there's a strange kind of a pressure to participate in living with you know, your phone and engaging with the phone in certain ways. It'd be really interesting as a social experiment to see something like that happen. I'm kind of thinking, as you're talking about library spaces too, in Ireland in the last few years, library spaces have become more digitized and have received funding to kind of become more digitized. Now, I think that there's assets that they have now that are really valuable, like BorrowBox is just amazing, you know, and it's incredible, all of the free resources on BorrowBox. It's like, for people who haven't used it to date, it's essentially like free Kindle, you know, like you can access loads and loads of books, and the interface of it is quite nice, and there's a very wide selection of reading material. So I know that they've obviously invested in certain things like that I think are definitely giving people more access to books, albeit still through a device. But what you're saying about education, absolutely, I think in terms of critical thinking, I love that idea of even a building that's Wi-Fi free, you know, because I think a lot of people do want that, but it doesn't exist. It's harder to find. But I think people want it. And it is funny to think when you're saying, you know, you've been waiting and not necessarily seeing that and feeling a bit dismayed with the absence of it. But there is a want there, and you've acknowledged that, and we agree on that. There is a want for what you're describing. It's interesting that people don't feel enabled for whatever reason to do it. Maybe we just need a bit more courage around it. I was told last summer that there are groupings now of people who are like 19, 20, like going into college, getting dumb phones and not wanting smartphones. I met a guy last summer and he and his friends all had your phone, Donna. But I was delighted. It kind of was heartening because I thought, oh, okay, interesting. Like if they are 20 and this is what they want to do, I said, why? Like, why do you have these phones? And he said, well, we just don't want apps and we want to communicate with each other in a meaningful way. And I thought that's really interesting that as we're going through different generations and eras, there is something really concrete about connection and wanting to connect. And it gave me kind of some hope that if younger people of that age are deciding to opt out, that's going to have a huge effect because they are a market. And like Snapchat, and I'm thinking like TikTok as well, that particular market have, in my opinion, been really exploited by certain platforms because they don't necessarily have the tools socially to be mindful about how they're engaging with something. And like in the same way that, you know, adults are meant to be responsible for helping, you know, young people eat well and understand nutrition, you know, and understand that like whatever they're putting into their bodies is going to directly affect their health. You know, a 5-year-old doesn't understand the value of broccoli, you know, but we understand. So we try to insist that he or she eats broccoli, you know, and I think that there's been a lack of social responsibility in that way with certain companies. And, you know, I don't even know, I suppose I'm thinking more about companies than guardians or parents, but there's kind of been a lack of integrity there, maybe with how they have willfully designed very addictive means for young people to become engaged with the internet in a way that is harmful, is often more harmful than good.
I mean, I think absolutely. I mean, I think there is a lack of social responsibility to these to these companies. And, you know, I think for a long while, because this all happened so fast, you know, there was a way in which we were all innocent, you know, like, or like the users of these things, there was a period where we were all sort of innocent, and it's sort of like we experienced it as a tidal wave. But it's not, you know, we know now, like it's been a while now that it's not no longer a tidal wave. It's a choice. Yeah. We're making a choice to be helpless in the face of it. Mm-hmm. We're just not doing the work or making the decisions or like the presidents of universities and like the people who run them are just being like, oh, we can't, but of course we can, like we can make these decisions, and we're just not doing it. And, parents are just not doing it because they're addicted themselves. We're all, we're all kind of addicted. And I almost think there's like a fear of like, I think it's amazing that there's groups of, college kids who are like, I'm going to have a dumb phone in college. Cause often I suggest that sometimes to students, and because they'll be like, some people will be like, I'm so jealous of you that you have a dumb phone. Like this, I hear this a lot. Like people will say that. And so I'll say back like, well, you could have a dumb phone too. And they're like, no, it's impossible. And there's sort of this like, no, we can't. And I think, no, you just have to decide, that it's not perfect having a dumb phone, like sometimes you have to ask for directions because you're lost and you don't have GPS. And so like, you're making a choice, and it does come with some difficult things. But I think for me, the benefits are huge. And I don't want to live in a world where I have a smartphone. Like, I don't want to be that. I just don't want to live that way. And so I think you just have to make this decision, and, whether it's you change your phone or you like you unplug the internet at your house for like an hour or two every day. Or like I have a friend who makes her kids, she has like a cell phone dock for the whole family right when they walk in the door. And when you walk in the door, you dock your phone and that's it. You're in the house. You're not on it.
Yeah.
And, I really admire that she's really hard line about it too, but her kids, they don't use a phone at home. Like that's what they've grown up with. But I think we just need to decide to make those decisions. And I think we're just not at this point.
Yeah.
So, because we can, like, I often wonder, like, what if a university, like, I don't think I'll ever see this, but like, imagine if a university, like we have 1 million universities in the United States, they're all competing with each other, right? They're really competitive. Imagine if one university decided we're going to be the Wi-Fi, like we're not going to have internet. I don't know. We're going to be all analog. Like I sometimes wonder, like as a way of distinguishing itself.
Yeah.
Like I sometimes wonder, like, would they shoot to the top of the ratings? Because so many people would apply. Because I do think that there is a desire for this.
Yeah.
But no one is meeting the needs, or like, very few places are actually being like, we're going to do this. Like, we're going to really do this and see what happens. So. Yeah,
totally. I would totally agree. I think the novelty factor alone is so immense. I imagine that there would be a consequence of that, potential positive consequence. So I guess, Donna, to wrap this up, that we could keep going really all day, but maybe let's wrap up with a kind of ideas or actions list for different kinds of people who might be watching this or seeing this, in terms of ways that they might be able to unplug. So let's start with, say, young people and teenagers especially who might be watching this. Do you have any ideas as a creative or as a writer or as a teacher what they might be able to do exercise wise to distance themselves a bit from social media, their phones, the app world?
Speaking of, my cell phone just is ringing and ringing and ringing. Someone's trying to reach me. So hopefully it's not an emergency. I think just making these like really simple choices, like, not having your phone next to you when you're, when you're reading, or I think even teachers though have to be hard line about that. Like we have to be hard line about these things in a lot of ways. Like it has to be a decision we make. Like we can't, like you can't just sort of give in to the fact that, oh, my students have smartphones, they're going to talk on them, or they're going to look at them during my class. Like I just don't want to fight it. Or I'm really hard line with students when in my classroom, and like they know I'm serious. Like, and they know, like I actually make consequences. And it becomes kind of like, I feel like in the beginning they test me, and then they realize, oh no, she's serious, and then it becomes kind of a joke, like, oh, Professor Freitas, don't even go near your phone. Like, don't even go near the phone. Like, you're in our class. You know what I mean? I think people they come around, and I think, whether it's yourself and you want to change your relationship to things, you just have to start making these decisions, and you just have to commit, and you have to think about how I'm doing this for a higher purpose. I'm doing this because I want to enjoy life more, not less. And because I do think that that's ultimately when we do like find ways to gain control of our usage.
Mm-hmm.
The upshot is more pleasure, less stress. And I think we just keep forgetting that, or we just don't even realize it, I think, anymore. But I do think that is the upshot. Like, it's not that life gets harder, life gets different. But life gets better. And you know, and I think that's why we're doing it, and we just have to like remember that.
Yeah, and that's a lovely thing to end on, I guess, is that idea of creating space, like more headspace, a positive space to be more present. And also, you know, you can still escape through books and reading, but it's a little bit more of a mindful escape and a bit more of an engagement with your imagination, which is a good thing. Donna, thanks so much for the chat. I really enjoyed this, and thank you to Clare Library Service for putting on this event, and it's been really nice to talk to you.
Oh, thank you so much for the wonderful conversation.
Have a good day.